Just as poets and painters, sculptors, filmmakers were experimenting with new forms of language, with new conceptions of time and space, just as we saw before, surrealism, Dadaism, Cubism. Another group of writers, fiction writers, like Franz Kafka, Czech-born, German-writing novelist, were publishing astonishing books that really penetrated what it would be called the spirit of the time, the absurdity of modern life, the irrationality of the bourgeois society. His novels, for example, The Castle, The Process, The Metamorphosis, tell stories about non-linear plots that never end because there is no logical solution. The Castle, for example, for years, an employee is trying to reach the owner, the master, the landlord of those lands without ever being able to access to him. Then The Metamorphosis, about a regular guy who one day suddenly wakes up in the form of a beetle. Why? We never know. The novel doesn't explain, but we have to guess, we have to participate actively in the interpretation of the book. Why does a person who has done nothing really extraordinary wakes up as a beetle? Probably the absurdity of his former life, the real self of the character was monstrous because he was completely alienated by the capitalist form of life, open to interpretation. James Joyce, who published, among others, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, hard to understand many times, particularly starting with Ulysses, a very experimental novel, divided in 24 chapters, just like the 24 hours of a day, but also correspond to the 24 chants of the Odyssey. Ulysses, remember, the hero of Greek mythology, the main character of the Odyssey, the long epic poem by Homer in ancient Greece. Well, Ulysses by Joyce, published in 1922, a crucial year in the production of many important works of the avant-garde, like The Waistline by Eliot or Trilce by Peruvian Cesar Vallejo. Ulysses was the depiction of the life of one individual in Dublin sometime in the early 20th century for 24 hours. Nothing more, nothing less. But the way in which this occurs, the stream of consciousness, the flow of images, of dialogues, the experimental form, make of this novel something really groundbreaking for its time. In France, Marcel Proust, who had a more linear style, more classical in that sense, that is more understandable, however, was writing a prose that was very indebted to the concern about the recuperation of time. His main work in 7 volumes, entitled precisely In Search of the Lost Time, à la recherche du temps perdu in French, was a beautiful canvas of the decadent society of oligarchic France in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the emergence of a bourgeoisie that was taking over politics and the means of production in that period of French history. In Latin America, Jorge Luis Borges, today considered a classic, he started as a poet, as a vanguardist poet, and suddenly he switched to fiction and wrote short stories, never a novel. He didn't like the novel. He said the novel was a literary genre that was a waste of words. So he concentrated mainly in short stories and essays, and he continued writing poetry. Some of his most renowned books are fictions, for example, a collection of short stories, Universal History of Infamy, the Aleph, which is a concept that comes from ancient knowledge one point in the world in which you can see all the other points. Supreme knowledge. How to achieve that? Borges doesn't explain it. He locates his short story in the cellar of a middle-class house in Buenos Aires and philosophizes. He reflects on different aspects of life in Buenos Aires, in the world in general. We have William Faulkner, the Southern American writer who depicts the life of rural North America, Absalom, Absalom, the sound of the fury, also in a very experimental kind of language, joining dialogues. Sometimes it's hard to follow his sequence, the plots, but nonetheless a wonderful portrait of the first half of 20th century United States, the southern states particularly. And a classic, a premio Nobel, a Nobel Prize, Ernest Hemingway. A big fan of fishing, bullfighting. He participated in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. He worked in novels in kind of straightforward prose due to his long training in journalism. For Whom the Bell Toll, for The Old Man and the Sea, and many other novels that portray the life of Europe, Latin America, France in the first half of the 20th century and the 1950s too. So these extraordinary narrators, fiction writers, represent just part of the big legacy of the 20th century to basically the genre of novel, but also of the short stories, representing the absurdity of our modern world, the illogical sense of human relations, the abuse of power, the tragedy of one world falling apart while another one, not necessarily better, is emerging.